Several weeks ago, feminist philosophy journal Hypatia published Rebecca Tuvel's article in Defense of Transracialism. In it, Tuvel argues that we ought to accept transracial identities on the same grounds on which transgender identities are accepted. The backlash was immediate. In a public Facebook post, University of Tennessee philosophy professor Nora Berenstain charged Tuvel with liberal white ignorance, discursive transmisogynistic violence, and epistemic violence. An open letter denouncing Tuvel as an incompetent, if not unethical scholar, even garnered 836 signatures before being delivered to Hypatia's editorial staff. Students even reported their other professors saying that Hypatia should apologize for or even retract Tuvel's article. But these professors complained that the petition writers had gone about it in the wrong way. On the other hand, the comment sections of philosophy's most trafficked blogs, Leiter Reports and the Daily Nous, were largely filled with comments defending Tuvel. I'm interested in the strange charge of epistemic violence. I will argue that, in spite of the censorious way the charge is wielded, it actually does point to an important feature of disagreement. I begin by laying out Tuvel's position, and then examine the charge of epistemic violence. Rebecca Tuvel's article uses Rachel Dolezal's attempted transition from white to black to highlight the tension between transracial non-acceptance and transgender acceptance. After all, it is a commonplace on college campuses at least to describe race and gender as social constructions. If the alleged social construction of gender, going so far as to separate it entirely from biological sex, requires us to call Bruce Caitlin, then it stands to reason that the social construction of race, perhaps going so far as to separate it entirely from skin color and other visible and heritable traits, requires acknowledging that Dolezal really is black. The argument proceeds as follows. Without overriding reasons to the contrary, we treat a person wrongly when we block that person from assuming his or her chosen identity. People self-identify as members of other races, therefore we should not block people from assuming identities as members of other races. The first premise is complicated because personal identity involves both personal and social components. As Tuvel puts it, adopting an identity involves others' willingness to accept one as a member. I lean more towards speaking of how personal identity is negotiated with others in dialogue, but let's allow Tuvel's point to stand as is for the sake of argument. For Tuvel, overriding reason to deny someone's chosen identity is critical to the first premise because without it, denial will appear arbitrary and unjust. An overriding reason is a compelling reason all parties ought to recognize and might be found in some relevant difference between transgenderism and transracialism. One such difference might be drawn along biological lines. For example, if we say that male to female transgender persons are born with female brains and male bodies, but that there is no black brain or white brain, then transgenderism would be different from transracialism. However, as Tuvel points out, this biological attempt to deny transracial identity comes at the cost of pinning transgenderism on the very connection between gender and biology that gender theorists eagerly deny. Without a biological reason that gender theorists and critical race theorists could accept, Tuvel confronts four moral objections to accepting transracial identities. First, it is morally unacceptable to assume a black identity without growing up with the black experience. Second, the social understanding of race limits the otherwise legitimate choice to change race. Third, changing race insults those born into the race one is transitioning to. And fourth, white people identifying as black is a manifestation of white privilege and is therefore wrong. Unfortunately for Tuvel's objectors, the first objection applies as much to trans women as to trans blacks. After all, many feminists will speak of women's experience and define this in terms of oppression in ways similar to what critical race theorists say about the black experience. Since trans women, for example, do not grow up with this experience, their assumed identities are unacceptable by the objection standards of rectitude. The second objection undermines the moral legitimacy of transgenderism in many social contexts, for example, those in which the dominant culture fixes gender to the genitalia with which one is born. At the very least, this objection undermines the legitimacy of Bruce's transition to Caitlin. The third objection relies on likening Dolezal's assumed identity as an instance of blackface. However, blackface occurs when one identifying as white appears as black, especially as a form of mockery. This is not what Dolezal is doing. She really does identify as black and can be understood as affirming blackness by sincerely choosing it. Fourth, assuming the discourse of privilege behind the objection, one can make the same point about male privilege as one can about white privilege. The objection standards thus morally delegitimize the identities of trans women. Therefore, Tuvel argues, if you accept transgenderism on the usual grounds, then you had better accept transracialism too, and on those same grounds. But for this argument, Tuvel was pilloried. Early in the controversy, Nora Berenstain accused Tuvel of liberal white ignorance, discursive trans-misogynistic violence, and epistemic violence in a public Facebook post that has since been taken down. Here again, we find the complaint that Tuvel neither cites women of color philosophers nor brings up white supremacy. However, Tuvel does bring up biological sex and male genitalia, for which she was condemned as actively ignorant and violent. Berenstain goes so far as to liken Tuvel's publication to Anna Stubblefield's Good Intentions defense after being charged with the aggravated sexual assault of a severely disabled black man. The comments on this post were uniformly positive. But what on earth is epistemic violence? Epistemic violence is to drag the discourse of the other through a conceptual field to which its adherents have no responsibility to conform in order to refute it. The idea is that different discourses follow different standards of what counts as knowledge, and holding one discourse up to the standards of another is to do violence to its adherents. The violence is supposed to arise through the process of othering, insofar as that involves marking someone or some group as unusual or inferior, or when outgroup members' claims don't get uptake and so have lower testimonial significance. The charge of epistemic violence is connected to discursive transmisogynistic violence as a genre to species. Consider that on this way of thinking, by bringing up biological sex and genitalia, Tuvel introduces terms that are commonly used to link gender to sex. After all, if the claims of male to female transgender persons are ontologically legitimate, then there is very little sense in talking about any specifically female genitalia. Doing so is to say that trans women, for example, are unusual or deficient in femaleness in some way for having penises rather than vaginas. The idea is that they are subjected to a discourse that marginalizes them by calling their experiences and identities as women into question. All of this, of course, is blamed on liberal white blindness. Behind the charge is the idea that privilege produces forms of blindness that subaltern status penetrates. On this view, white liberal discourse is seen as a dominant narrative that is endemically racist, sexist, and transphobic. This narrative constructs a set of ideas that come to be called truth, which its beneficiaries blindly accept and reinforce with their own particular stories of events. Subaltern individuals can see through the veil of imagined truth and can challenge the dominant narrative through their own counter-narratives. At the least, subalterns could be said to navigate both the dominant discourse that oppresses them and their own subaltern discourse. Subaltern testimony is thereby epistemically privileged, and subaltern status made a signifier of expertise. This is why social justice types so eagerly clamor for subaltern status. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the Oppression Olympics. Because Tuvel is a cis-white woman, she is epistemically disadvantaged and should defer to subaltern testimony. Perceived lack of deference is why Tuvel's bibliography is libeled as scholarly incompetence. The idea that identity alone confers expertise is, of course, highly questionable. With that in mind, my next point will sound very strange, so bear with me. We can understand the idea of epistemic violence as arising from a set of true observations. In his piece, First Principles, Alistair MacIntyre points out that the meaning of an expression is not independent of the context of theory within which it is employed. The intractability of radical philosophical disagreement reveals that theory and idiom are to some significant degree inseparable. Thus, insofar as one attempts to deny a theory while being made to employ its idiom, he may be trapped into presupposing the very theory he is trying to deny. Epistemic Violence could be read as an expression of frustration over this fact. The problem being described here is more than question-begging argument of the abortion is wrong because it is murder, or abortion is right because a woman has a right to do whatever she wants with her body variety. Each of these arguments is question-begging because it presupposes what it is trying to prove, but in a way that does not rest on idiom. Conservatives will certainly be familiar with examples that are more to the point, as when traditional sexual morality is dragged through the standards of the cult of choice or John Stuart Mill's harm principle. And conservatives cannot formulate their arguments on those terms without defeating themselves almost immediately. Gender theorists can feel this way when they are dismissed out of hand by conservatives. In the midst of such radical disagreement, different and non-dismissive approaches are in order. There's actually a good biblical example of this. In Acts chapter 13, Paul, a Jewish man speaking to the Jewish community, can marshal arguments from within his own tradition and sacred texts. However, when Paul goes to Athens 4 chapters later, he cannot do this. He cannot subject pagan, Stoic, and Epicurean philosophy to the presumptions of Jewish discourse. Such dismissiveness would defeat his entire purpose of trying to convince them. Instead, Paul must meet the pagan philosophers on their own terms. This is what he does by using the altar to an unknown god as an entry point. He can then discuss how the Greek poets and philosophers point to a god that is more than gold and jewels and stone, or the temporal beings those signify. In this and other ways, he can point to problems the Athenians recognize, and offer his new faith as a more comprehensive and compelling vision that encompasses the truths their traditions have grasped, while solving those problems. Yet, Tuvel engages in disagreement by pointing out inconsistency on the basis of premises both gender theorists and critical race theorists might accept. She then pushes these premises to their logical conclusion. Radical disagreement extending into idiom and frustration over that fact does not appear to be the problem. What she has done can hardly be epistemic violence of the sort Paul would have engaged in had he blithely dismissed Stoic philosophy by subjecting it to the law and the prophets. So what's going on? A friend of mine told me a story about a philosophy of human rights seminar run by a professor who is a consequentialist. Much of the discussion involved working through thought experiments to test the professor's premises. For example, would these premises require us to intern HIV patients? Mark them so prospective sexual partners would know? And so on. No one was arguing for any of that. They just wanted to see if any of it would present a modus tollens refutation of the premise, or if the professor would bite the bullet. Analytically, this is an excellent exercise. However, a sociology student in the seminar was horrified. She couldn't understand that the arguments to extreme conclusions were attempts at refutation. She could only see them as modus ponens arguments for those conclusions. My friend pointed out that if you have an overly pragmatic approach to life, you only see argument as a way of trying to get people to agree with your conclusions. That's the activist mentality. Any premise is good that gets you to the conclusion. Any premise that does not is bad. In her argument for transracial acceptance, Tuvel engaged in modus tollens refutation of a number of objections. Recall the argument that if one thinks it is unacceptable to assume a black identity without growing up with a black experience, then one couldn't accept transgender persons either. The argument only works because Tuvel herself believes, and believes her audience believes, that transgender persons should be accepted as of the gender with which they identify. However, transgender activist theorists, mistaking that exercise for an argument against transgender acceptance, would go a long way toward explaining charges like discursive transmisogynistic violence. The conflict here is not radical, or even over where an agreed-upon premise leads. Instead, it is political and methodological. The conflict is political because scholars in the relevant subdisciplines appear to have different activist goals. Deviating from these goals from the inside, and Tuvel has the misfortune of working at the intersection of feminist philosophy, philosophy of race, and animal ethics, as she puts it, will engender outrage regardless of the premises. The conflict is methodological because Tuvel wrote an analytic paper prizing conceptual analysis and logical consistency, that is, white and liberal, in a discourse that prizes Marxist or postmodern historical contextual description and deconstruction on the one hand, and subaltern storytelling in the service of counter-narrative production on the other. Here, Tuvel's methods are seen as a threat because Socrates' injunction to follow the argument wherever it leads threatens an activist goal, challenges an activist narrative, or forces an examination of subaltern testimony by a person who is not a member of the relevant subaltern class. In this way, Tuvel's paper is seen as discursive, transmisogynistic, and epistemic violence. Epistemically privileging subaltern identity groups sets up a worrisome identity politics when we should be careful in our assumptions about who really has epistemic privilege. Education, for example, can increase your understanding, but it can also narrow your perspective. Experiencing poverty can give one insight into poverty and oppression, but might also cause one to blame even self-inflicted problems on everyone but oneself. I've known both types of people, and you probably have too. There are thus good reasons to question stories and discourses sympathetically from the outside or through different methods, and this does not imply violence against some or other identity. On the contrary, it is important if we care about a politics steered not by activist aims, but by the truth. In the Tuvel-Hypatia debate, the accusation of epistemic violence does not signal blithe dismissal or sidelining of subaltern testimony. It is, in fact, used to shut down discourse in slavish obedience to activism, whereas the real goal of the knowledge of epistemic violence is to promote discourse in pursuit of the argument and ultimately the truth. I recognize that the postmodern mindset does not admit the existence of truth with a capital T, and that I might be accused of epistemic violence of my own by declaring that there is such a thing, and that it is the proper object of the intellect. The question of truth is one I must set aside for another time, so for now I offer only some food for thought. If there is no truth, then there is no moral truth. However, it is the violation of moral truth, such as the real existence of some human right or other, that is usually invoked to ground moral outrage in reason and to point to its significance in human life. Without truth, can Berenstain claim that her response is rational? Must she admit that her discourse is no more than a power play, no more than bullying? The charges against Tuvel are unwarranted in their substance and viciousness. However, there are some insights lurking in the ideas from which the charges are derived that resist outright mockery and condemnation. Examining the contexts of disagreement and debate in which a person might feel unjustly dismissed or ignored is useful because it teaches us something about the nature of radical philosophical disagreement and how to address it when we encounter it. These are lessons that classical liberals and conservatives can use in debate with left progressives and probably haven't used enough. If you liked this video, if you found it helpful, or if it otherwise made you think, comment, share, click like, or subscribe.